Welcome to Mafia Stories, where every story reveals more than crime and power. Here, you'll discover loyalty, betrayal, romance, ambition, and the choices that shape a lifetime. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If you believe kindness can be stronger than power, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Now, let's step into Ethan Romano's world. The crystal chandeliers of Bellissimo, Manhattan's most exclusive Italian restaurant, bathed the dining room in warm amber light. Soft violin music floated through the air while waiters in crisp white jackets moved with rehearsed precision between tables draped in imported linen. Every polished wine glass reflected wealth. Every whispered conversation carried the confidence of people who had never worried about tomorrow. Yet on that evening, none of the luxury mattered. Because one small child wouldn't stop crying. The sound cut through the elegant atmosphere like a blade through silk. It wasn't the ordinary fussing of a tired baby. It was desperate. Raw. Relentless. 8-month-old Lucas Romano screamed until his tiny face flushed crimson, his little fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned pale. Tears soaked the collar of his tiny navy sweater as his cries echoed across the dining room, drowning out the orchestra one heartbreaking wail after another. Forks paused halfway to elegant plates. Business conversations faded. Even the sommelier stopped pouring a bottle that cost more than most people earned in a month. Every pair of eyes drifted toward the private dining section. Toward the man holding the child. Ethan Romano. At 36, Ethan possessed the kind of presence that silenced rooms before he spoke a single word. Tall, broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, he looked less like a businessman and more like a king who had wandered into modern Manhattan. His sharp jawline remained expressionless, but the exhaustion beneath his piercing blue eyes betrayed a battle no rival family had ever managed to win. Across New York, people whispered his name with fear. Powerful executives lowered their voices when he entered. Politicians answered his calls before their own families. Entire criminal organizations had disappeared after making the mistake of challenging Ethan Romano. But none of that power could quiet the frightened child trembling in his arms. Lucas cried harder. A pediatric nurse knelt beside the table, checking the baby's temperature for the third time. "He's perfectly healthy, Mr. Romano." Another bottle. Another pacifier. Another attempt. Nothing worked. One nanny gently rocked the infant until her own arms shook from exhaustion. Lucas screamed. Another tried warming a fresh bottle. He turned his head away. The restaurant manager personally ordered the kitchen to prepare warm water, fresh formula, herbal tea, anything the medical team suggested. Nothing. Nearly 90 minutes had passed. The elegant dinner had long been forgotten. Guests who had once come to celebrate anniversaries and business deals now watched with uneasy silence. No one dared complain. No one dared leave without permission. The entire restaurant seemed suspended between compassion and fear, waiting for something, anything, to change. Ethan loosened his grip on the expensive linen napkin in his hand. For the first time that evening, frustration cracked the calm mask he wore before the world. "What am I missing?" he asked quietly, almost to himself. No one answered. Because no one knew. His security team exchanged helpless glances. The doctors had already ruled out illness. The bottles had failed. The toys had failed. The lullabies had failed. Money had failed. Power had failed. And perhaps, for the first time in his adult life, Ethan Romano understood what true helplessness felt like. Not when facing armed rivals. Not during negotiations worth hundreds of millions. But while watching his own son cry with a pain he couldn't erase. Several tables away, hidden behind polished oak panels and trays of untouched desserts, Naomi Carter stood frozen. She had spent the last hour pretending to refill water glasses she knew were already full. Every cry from Lucas struck somewhere deep inside her chest. Her fingers tightened around the serving tray. Her breathing grew shallow. Then it happened. A dull ache spread beneath her neatly pressed black uniform. Small at first. Then impossible to ignore. Naomi lowered her eyes for only a second. She knew that pain. She had been fighting it every single day. Her body remembered something her heart had begged it to forget. She closed her eyes. "Please," she whispered so softly that no one could hear. "Not tonight." But another desperate cry from Lucas echoed across the restaurant. And suddenly, her body answered before her mind could. The room remained silent. Naomi's eyes slowly opened. Something no one else in Bellissimo could understand had just awakened inside her. Naomi lowered the serving tray onto the polished counter with careful hands, but the trembling in her fingers refused to stop. She had learned long ago that the best waitresses became invisible. They smiled when spoken to, remembered every order, anticipated every request, and quietly disappeared before anyone noticed them. For nearly 8 months, Bellissimo had been her refuge, a place where hard work mattered more than painful memories. Yet tonight, every cry from the little boy seemed to tear open a wound she had spent months trying to hide. 3 months earlier, Naomi had believed her entire future would fit inside a tiny nursery painted soft shades of blue and white. She had spent evenings folding little blankets, reading bedtime stories aloud to a baby who had not even entered the world yet, and dreaming about first birthdays, first steps, and family photographs that would someday cover her apartment walls. Life, however, had followed a different path. Complications had arrived without warning, and the dreams she carried home from every doctor appointment slowly disappeared. When she finally returned to her apartment alone, the silence became heavier than anything she had ever known. Friends tried to comfort her. Neighbors left meals outside her door. Her church family prayed with her. Nothing filled the empty space waiting inside her heart. Even after returning to work, Naomi carefully avoided walking past children's clothing stores. She muted television commercials showing happy families. She smiled at customers while quietly carrying a grief that no uniform could hide. Her body healed more slowly than her heart wanted. Her physician had gently explained that healing followed its own schedule and that some reminders would remain for a while. Naomi accepted every explanation with quiet dignity, never complaining, never asking why life had chosen her story instead of someone else's. Every morning before work, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror, took a slow breath, and whispered the same promise to herself. "Today I will keep moving forward." Most days, she succeeded. She worked double shifts, helped new employees learn the menu, and always volunteered to stay late whenever another server needed to leave early. Her kindness had earned the respect of everyone in the restaurant, although very few people knew anything about the sadness hidden behind her warm smile. The restaurant manager simply believed Naomi possessed extraordinary patience. Her co-workers often joked that she could calm even the most demanding guests with a single gentle sentence. They had no idea that compassion came naturally to someone who understood loss. Back in the dining room, Lucas cried again, his tiny voice sounding weaker now than before. Naomi instinctively looked toward the private dining area. Ethan continued walking slowly with his son, gently rocking him while speaking in a calm voice that carried both hope and exhaustion. She recognized that expression immediately. It was the face of someone desperately searching for one answer after every other answer had failed. Naomi pressed one hand lightly against her chest as another familiar ache reminded her that some parts of motherhood did not simply disappear because life had changed. She quickly looked around to make certain no one noticed her discomfort. Every instinct told her to stay where she was. She was only a waitress. Crossing the dining room without permission could cost her the job she depended upon. Bellissimo paid enough for her small apartment, her car payment, and the counseling sessions that had slowly helped her begin putting one foot in front of the other again. Losing this job was not an option. Yet another heartbreaking cry echoed beneath the crystal chandeliers, and for a brief moment, the entire restaurant seemed to disappear. There was no elegant dining room. No wealthy guests. No polished silverware. Only one frightened father, one exhausted little boy, and one woman whose heart still remembered exactly what a hungry infant sounded like. Naomi drew one slow breath and reached for another stack of warm dinner plates, hoping the simple motion would quiet the battle inside her. It did not. Lucas cried again, his tiny voice cracking as exhaustion replaced strength, and every sound echoed through the restaurant with heartbreaking clarity. She had heard that cry before, not from this little boy, but from countless sleepless nights spent preparing for the child she had dreamed of holding. Some instincts never truly disappeared. They waited quietly beneath the surface, awakening the moment another child needed comfort. Across the dining room, Ethan carefully shifted Lucas onto his shoulder, gently rubbing the baby's back while whispering reassuring words. His expensive suit jacket was wrinkled now, something that would have seemed impossible only an hour earlier. His perfectly styled hair had begun to fall out of place. He no longer looked like the confident man whose presence commanded every room. He looked like every exhausted parent who had reached the painful moment of admitting that love alone was not enough to solve the problem. The pediatric nurse spoke softly once more. Perhaps he simply needs time. Ethan nodded politely, but disappointment lingered in his tired eyes. Time was exactly what Lucas had already spent crying. Nearby, 2 members of his security team remained respectfully silent. They knew how to manage difficult situations, organize complicated schedules, and anticipate every possible risk. Yet none of their experience offered even the smallest answer for the frightened child in Ethan's arms. Around them, guests exchanged quiet conversations filled with sympathy rather than judgment. An elderly woman wiped away a tear as she watched Lucas struggle to settle down. A young couple gently rocked their own sleeping infant closer, silently remembering evenings that had once felt endless. Compassion slowly replaced curiosity throughout the elegant dining room. Naomi watched every expression, but her attention always returned to Lucas. She noticed the way his tiny fingers repeatedly searched against Ethan's jacket. She saw the restless movement of his head, the frustrated turning away from another offered bottle, and the weakening rhythm of his cries. Something about those small movements stirred a memory so vivid that it nearly stole her breath. During one appointment months before, a compassionate nurse had patiently explained how babies often communicated long before they could speak. Hunger, comfort, familiarity, warmth, safety. Every movement carried meaning if someone knew how to listen. Naomi had listened carefully then because she believed she would soon become a mother. Those lessons had remained with her even after everything else had changed. Her heartbeat quickened. She looked toward the kitchen entrance, then back toward Ethan. Every practical thought urged her to stay where she belonged. She was a waitress serving expensive meals, not a childcare professional. Walking into the private dining section uninvited would almost certainly end her employment. Bellissimo had strict policies protecting guests, especially important ones. Crossing that invisible line meant risking everything she had rebuilt during the past 3 months. Yet another cry echoed beneath the chandeliers, softer now, carrying more exhaustion than strength. Naomi's eyes closed for only a second. She silently remembered the promise she had made to herself after returning to work. Keep moving forward. Keep choosing kindness. Keep believing that love never disappears simply because life changes. When she opened her eyes again, something inside her had become unexpectedly calm. Fear was still there, but compassion had quietly become stronger. She carefully untied the apron around her waist, folded it with deliberate hands, and placed it beside the untouched dessert trays. One of her co-workers looked up in surprise as Naomi stepped away from the service station. "Where are you going?" the young waitress whispered. Naomi never answered. Her eyes remained fixed on one little boy whose cries had reached a heart that could no longer pretend not to hear them. Naomi walked slowly across the polished marble floor, each measured step feeling heavier than the one before it. Conversations faded as curious eyes followed the young waitress leaving her section. The restaurant manager noticed her first. "Naomi," He called in a hushed but urgent voice, "The private dining area is off limits." She paused for only a heartbeat before continuing forward. She was not ignoring the rules because she believed they were unimportant. She was walking because, deep inside, something even stronger than fear refused to let her stand still. Before she reached Ethan's table, one of the security professionals respectfully stepped into her path. His expression remained calm, but his posture made the boundary unmistakably clear. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "please return to your station." Naomi stopped and nodded politely. "I understand," she answered. "I am not here to disturb anyone." Lucas cried again, his tiny body trembling against his father's shoulder. Naomi looked at the little boy instead of the guard. "I only want to help." The guard hesitated for a brief moment before gently shaking his head. "Mr. Romano has medical professionals with him." Naomi glanced toward the pediatric nurse, who stood nearby with compassionate eyes but no new answers to offer. The silence surrounding the table said everything words could not. Everyone had tried. Nothing had worked. Ethan slowly turned toward the unexpected voice. His tired blue eyes rested on Naomi for the first time that evening. She saw neither anger nor impatience. Only exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that settles into a parent's heart after every possible solution has failed. "What is your name?" Ethan asked quietly. "Naomi Carter, sir." "You work here?" "Yes, sir." Ethan studied her for a long moment. There was nothing remarkable about her uniform. Nothing expensive about her appearance. She looked like any hard-working waitress finishing another busy shift. Yet there was a calmness in the way she stood, as though she had walked into difficult moments before and learned not to panic. "What makes you think you can help?" Ethan asked. Naomi swallowed carefully. Every person in the room seemed to hold the same question. She chose her words with great care. Because sometimes babies tell us what they need without using words. Several guests exchanged uncertain glances. The restaurant manager looked increasingly uncomfortable. One businessman quietly whispered that she should let the professionals handle the situation. Another guest folded his arms, unconvinced that a waitress could possibly recognize something everyone else had missed. Naomi heard none of it. Her attention never left Lucas. "May I ask one question?" she said softly. Ethan gave a slight nod. "Has he accepted any bottle tonight?" "No." "Any pacifier?" "No." "Has he rested at all?" Ethan looked down at his son before answering. "Not even for a minute." Naomi nodded almost to herself. Her heart beat faster. Every instinct she had tried to bury over the past 3 months now stood clearly before her. She looked back at Ethan with gentle honesty. "Sir, I may be completely wrong." She paused, searching for the courage to finish the sentence. "But I do not believe he is refusing comfort. I believe he is still searching for it." The room became perfectly still. Even the violinists had quietly lowered their bows. Ethan's expression changed ever so slightly. It was not belief. Not yet. It was curiosity. Real curiosity. Naomi took one careful breath. "If you trust me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I would like to try something. But I would only do so with your permission, and only somewhere private where your son's dignity is protected." No one spoke. The crystal chandeliers continued glowing above the silent dining room as every eye remained fixed on Ethan Romano, waiting to see whether a father who had exhausted every option would place his trust in the least expected person in the room. The silence lingered so long that Naomi could hear the gentle ticking of the antique clock mounted above the restaurant's wine display. Ethan looked down at Lucas, whose cries had weakened into exhausted whimpers, then back at the young waitress standing before him with quiet sincerity. She was not demanding his trust. She was asking for permission. There was a difference, and somehow Ethan recognized it immediately. "Tell me what you are thinking," he said softly. Naomi hesitated, not because she doubted herself, but because the truth carried memories she had spent months trying to survive. "Sir," she began carefully, "my physician told me that after losing my baby, my body would need time to heal completely. Some parts of motherhood do not simply stop overnight." She lowered her eyes for a moment before continuing. "I believe your son may still be hungry, even if he cannot accept a bottle. If you are comfortable with it, and only with your permission, I may be able to help calm him in a private room where no one else is present." The words settled over the dining room like falling snow. Nobody reacted immediately. Several guests quietly looked away, understanding that this conversation deserved privacy and respect. The pediatric nurse stepped closer, studying Naomi with thoughtful eyes rather than surprise. "You understand what you are offering?" she asked gently. Naomi nodded. "Yes. I would never suggest anything that was not intended solely for the well-being of the child." The nurse looked toward Ethan. "The decision is yours, but her suggestion is centered on comforting the baby, and it should remain entirely private if you choose to proceed." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Every practical solution had already failed. He had spent nearly 2 hours watching his son struggle while experienced professionals searched for answers that never came. Now the final possibility stood before him in the form of a waitress whose voice never rose above kindness. He looked directly at Naomi. "You are asking for something that requires enormous trust." "I know," she answered. "If you say no, I will return to work immediately, and no one will ever hear another word from me about this." Ethan searched her face for hesitation, ambition, or any sign that she wanted something beyond helping his son. He found none. Only compassion. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. "Very well." The restaurant remained completely silent as Ethan carefully placed Lucas into Naomi's waiting arms. She accepted. The little boy with practiced gentleness, supporting his tiny head as though every movement mattered. Almost immediately, Lucas's tense shoulders relaxed ever so slightly, sensing warmth and calm even before understanding where he was. Naomi's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "Thank you," she whispered. Ethan gestured toward the private family lounge located just beyond the dining room. "You will have complete privacy," he said. "Take all the time you need." The pediatric nurse quietly accompanied Naomi to the doorway before stopping. "If you need anything, I will be right outside." Naomi offered a grateful smile before entering the comfortable room and softly closing the door behind her. The elegant dining room waited in complete stillness. No music played. No conversations resumed. Even the kitchen staff quietly paused their work. Minutes passed that somehow felt much longer. Ethan remained standing exactly where Naomi had left him, his hands now empty, his thoughts filled with equal parts uncertainty and hope. Then, from behind the closed door, the sound everyone had expected never came. There were no desperate cries. No restless sobs. Only a deep, peaceful silence that slowly spread through the restaurant, leaving every person present wondering whether they had just witnessed the beginning of something none of them would ever forget. 3 minutes passed. Then 4. To everyone waiting outside the private family lounge, time seemed to move more slowly than it ever had before. Ethan remained standing near the closed door with his hands resting quietly at his sides. He had faced complicated negotiations, impossible business decisions, and moments that demanded extraordinary patience, but nothing compared to waiting without knowing whether his son was finally at peace. No one interrupted the silence. The pediatric nurse leaned gently against the hallway wall, listening with careful attention. The restaurant manager quietly asked the musicians to remain on break. Guests who had intended to leave stayed seated instead, not out of curiosity, but because every person in the room sensed that something deeply human was unfolding behind that closed door. Then the nurse smiled. It was almost imperceptible at first, but Ethan noticed it immediately. "Do you hear that?" she asked softly. Ethan listened. There was nothing. No crying. No restless whimpering. No desperate gasps between exhausted tears. Only complete, peaceful silence. The kind of silence that every parent prays for after a child has finally found comfort. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, and a slow breath escaped his chest. He had almost forgotten what quiet sounded like. Another minute passed before the door slowly opened. Naomi stepped into the hallway carrying Lucas close against her shoulder. The little boy was fast asleep. His tiny fingers rested peacefully against the fabric of her uniform, and the worried expression that had filled his face all evening had completely disappeared. His breathing was slow and even. Every trace of fear had melted into the calm innocence only a sleeping child could carry. The hallway remained absolutely still. Ethan looked at his son first. Then at Naomi. Then back to Lucas again, almost as though he needed to convince himself that what he was seeing was real. Carefully, Naomi walked toward him. "He is resting now," she whispered, speaking as though even her voice deserved to protect the little boy's sleep. Ethan accepted Lucas into his arms with extraordinary care. The baby barely stirred. Instead, he nestled comfortably against his father's chest and continued sleeping peacefully. Ethan instinctively rested one hand against Lucas's back, feeling the slow rhythm of every relaxed breath. His eyes glistened for just a moment before he quietly looked away. The pediatric nurse stepped forward and gently checked the sleeping child once more. A warm smile spread across her face. "His breathing is calm," she said. "His heartbeat is steady." Whatever comfort he needed, he finally found it. Around them, relief slowly spread through the restaurant. Guests smiled at one another without speaking. An elderly gentleman quietly removed his glasses to wipe away tears. A young mother held her own child a little closer. Even members of the kitchen staff standing near the service entrance exchanged grateful looks. Before returning to their work, the violinists resumed playing, but this time the melody sounded softer, almost as though the music itself understood that peace had returned. Ethan turned toward Naomi. For several long seconds he said nothing. Earlier that evening, she had simply been another waitress serving dinner. Now she stood before him as the person who had reached his son when no one else could. "Thank you," he finally said, his voice low with genuine emotion. Naomi gently shook her head. "You do not owe me thanks, sir. Every child deserves comfort when they are hurting." Ethan studied her face again, this time noticing something he had overlooked before. There was kindness there, certainly, but also quiet sorrow. The kind carried only by someone who understood a parent's love from the inside. In that moment, Ethan realized this evening had not changed only his son's night. It had revealed the extraordinary strength hidden within a woman the world had almost failed to notice. The restaurant slowly returned to life, but the atmosphere had changed in a way no designer, musician, or chef could have planned. The elegant conversations resumed in softer voices. Crystal glasses caught the warm light once again. Fresh plates left the kitchen exactly on schedule. Yet every person who had witnessed the evening carried the same quiet realization. Sometimes the most extraordinary moments arrived without applause. Ethan gently adjusted the small blanket over Lucas as the sleeping child rested peacefully against his shoulder. He had expected relief after the crying stopped. Instead, he felt something far more unexpected. Curiosity. He looked toward Naomi, who had quietly retied her apron and begun collecting empty glasses from a nearby table as though nothing remarkable had happened. She was trying to disappear again. That struck him more deeply than anything else. Most people who had helped someone as influential as Ethan Romano would have expected recognition, favors, or attention. Naomi seemed to want only one thing: to finish her shift with dignity. Ethan carefully handed Lucas to the pediatric nurse for a routine examination while the baby continued sleeping peacefully. Then he walked toward Naomi. Every conversation nearby faded once again, not because anyone feared what might happen, but because everyone sensed this conversation mattered. Naomi looked up as Ethan approached. "Sir," she said politely. Is Lucas all right? Ethan noticed she asked about his son before asking about herself. He is sleeping better than he has in days, Ethan replied. The nurse says he is perfectly calm. Naomi smiled with quiet relief. I am very glad. Ethan studied her face. There is something I do not understand. Naomi waited patiently. You recognized something that experienced people did not. How? For the first time that evening, Naomi hesitated. Her eyes drifted toward the large windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline where city lights shimmered against the evening sky. Because, she answered softly, I spent many months preparing to become a mother. Ethan remained silent. Naomi continued, her voice calm despite the emotion beneath every word. I attended parenting classes every Saturday morning. I learned how babies communicate before they can speak. I practiced holding newborn dolls until it became natural. I read every book the library recommended. I believed I would need all of that knowledge. She paused for several seconds. 3 months ago, everything changed. Ethan did not interrupt. Neither did anyone standing close enough to overhear. Naomi gently folded a clean linen napkin between her hands. My daughter never came home with me. The nursery stayed exactly the way I had prepared it. The rocking chair remained by the window. The little blanket stayed folded inside the dresser. I could not bring myself to move any of them. Her voice never broke, yet every word carried the quiet weight of someone who had learned to live beside grief instead of escaping it. Returning to work was the only way I knew how to keep moving forward. I told myself that if I kept serving people with kindness every day, eventually my heart would learn how to breathe again. Ethan felt an unexpected tightness in his chest. He had assumed Naomi understood children because of professional experience. He had never imagined her compassion had been shaped by personal loss. The pediatric nurse quietly lowered her eyes, giving Naomi the privacy of being heard without being pitted. Naomi looked at Ethan once more. Tonight was never about proving anything, sir. When I heard Lucas crying, I did not see the son of an important man. I only saw a frightened little boy who needed comfort. Ethan glanced toward his sleeping son, then back at the woman standing before him. For the first time in years, words failed him completely. Power had taught him how to negotiate. Success had taught him how to lead. But standing before Naomi, he understood that neither wealth nor influence could create the kind of compassion born from a heart that had chosen love even after unimaginable loss. For several quiet moments, neither Ethan nor Naomi spoke. The sounds of Bellissimo gradually returned around them, yet the space between them seemed untouched by the clinking glasses and gentle violin melodies. Ethan had spent years believing he understood people. Experience had taught him how to recognize ambition hidden behind compliments and dishonesty disguised as kindness. But the woman standing before him fit none of the patterns he had learned to expect. She had asked for nothing. She had accepted no praise. She had simply seen a child in need and responded with compassion. Ethan glanced toward Lucas, who remained peacefully asleep in the pediatric nurse's arms. It was the most relaxed his son had looked in weeks. The constant restlessness that had worried him every evening had disappeared, replaced by the calm expression every parent longs to see. Ethan turned back to Naomi. How long have you worked here? He asked. Almost 8 months, sir, she answered. And before that? I worked wherever I could. Diners, cafes, grocery stores. Wherever honest work was available. Ethan nodded slowly. Your manager tells me you never miss a shift. Naomi smiled modestly. Many people depend on their jobs. I am one of them. Ethan looked toward the restaurant manager, who immediately stepped forward. Is everything she told me true? The manager did not hesitate. Every word, Mr. Romano. Naomi is the first person to volunteer when someone needs help. She stays late without complaining. She treats every guest with respect, whether they order coffee or the most expensive dinner on the menu. I have managed restaurants for 20 years, and I have never received a single complaint about her. Ethan quietly absorbed every sentence. Success had introduced him to countless talented people, but character was far more difficult to find. Tonight, he had witnessed both. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a simple business card embossed only with his name and a private telephone number. He placed it gently on the table beside Naomi. She looked down at it, then back at him with quiet confusion. "I would like to offer you a different opportunity," Ethan said. Naomi blinked in surprise. "Sir. Lucas has responded to you in a way that none of us expected. I cannot ignore what I witnessed tonight. I would like you to consider becoming part of my household staff as my son's caregiver." Naomi immediately shook her head, not out of disrespect, but uncertainty. "I appreciate your kindness, but I am not certain I am qualified for such responsibility." Ethan gave a faint smile. "Qualifications can be taught. Compassion cannot." The words settled gently between them. Naomi looked away for a moment, her eyes resting on the sleeping child. "I would never want anyone to believe I accepted because of tonight." Ethan answered without hesitation. "You would not be accepting because of tonight. You would be accepting because of who you have been every day before tonight." The pediatric nurse nodded in quiet agreement. "Children do not respond to titles or bank accounts," she said softly. "They respond to people who make them feel safe. Lucas made that choice on his own." Naomi felt her heart grow unexpectedly heavy. For months, she had struggled to believe she still had something meaningful to offer the world. Grief had convinced her that part of her life had ended forever. Yet standing inside the warm glow of Bellissimo, surrounded by strangers whose lives had quietly intersected for one unforgettable evening, she realized that perhaps love never truly disappeared. Perhaps it simply waited for another chance to serve someone else. Ethan gently extended his hand, not as a businessman closing an agreement, but as a grateful father offering trust. Naomi looked at his outstretched hand for several seconds before accepting it with quiet humility. In that simple handshake, neither of them fully understood that the greatest gift exchanged that evening was not an offer of employment. It was the restoration of hope for two hearts that had each been carrying a different kind of loneliness. 1 year later, the first morning sunlight spilled gently across the windows of the Romano estate, filling the breakfast room with a quiet warmth that felt very different from the silence Ethan had once feared. Laughter now lived inside those walls. Small footsteps echoed across polished hardwood floors. And every morning began with the cheerful voice of one little boy who had grown healthier, stronger, and happier than anyone had imagined on that unforgettable evening at Bellissimo. Lucas ran through the hallway carrying a stuffed bear tucked beneath one arm, his bright smile replacing the tears that had once filled his days. The household staff greeted him with affectionate smiles as he hurried toward the kitchen, where the aroma of fresh pancakes and cinnamon filled the air. Naomi stood at the counter preparing breakfast, wearing the same gentle expression she had carried from the very beginning. She had accepted Ethan's offer months earlier, but she never treated her new position as a privilege. To her, it remained what it had always been. An opportunity to care for another human being with kindness. "Good morning, Miss Naomi," Lucas called happily as he wrapped his small arms around her waist. Naomi smiled and gently returned the embrace before brushing a loose curl away from his forehead. "Good morning, sunshine. Did you sleep well?" Lucas nodded enthusiastically. "I dreamed about the zoo." Ethan entered a moment later, carrying a stack of paperwork that quickly became forgotten as he watched the simple exchange before him. There had been many mornings like this during the past year, yet each one reminded him of how dramatically life could change because of a single act of compassion. He no longer measured people by titles, expensive suits, or impressive resumes. He had learned to notice patience, honesty, humility, and quiet strength instead. Those qualities had transformed his home far more than wealth ever could. Naomi still visited the small church she had attended before joining the Romano household. She still volunteered at the neighborhood food pantry whenever she had a free afternoon. She still quietly left generous tips for restaurant servers because she remembered exactly what it felt like to depend on every dollar earned. Grief had not disappeared from her life, but it no longer defined every morning she woke. Instead, it had become the reason she noticed pain in others more quickly than most people ever could. Ethan often wondered whether she realized how many lives she had changed simply by refusing to let sorrow harden her heart. One afternoon, while they watched Lucas chase butterflies across the garden, Ethan finally asked the question that had remained in his mind for months. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Naomi smiled thoughtfully before answering. "Leaving sadness behind? Every day. Leaving this family? No. This place gave me something I believed I had lost forever. Purpose." Ethan nodded quietly. "You gave us the same gift." As Lucas laughed beneath the summer sky, he suddenly looked back toward them with complete innocence. "Papa," he shouted, "Miss Naomi says butterflies always come back when flowers are cared for." Ethan looked at Naomi, who simply smiled without realizing the lesson she had just spoken reached far beyond the garden. Some hearts were exactly like that. They blossomed again when surrounded by patience, compassion, and hope. Ethan gently placed one hand over Lucas's shoulder while the little boy reached for Naomi's hand with the other. Standing together beneath the warm afternoon sun, they did not look like people connected by wealth or circumstance. They looked like a family brought together by kindness. And on that quiet day, everyone who truly knew their story understood one unforgettable truth. Sometimes the greatest miracle is not that someone saves a life. It is that, through saving another, they discover their own life beginning again. And that day, the world remembered what dignity, compassion, and unconditional love truly look like.